Good morning, everyone. This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. And today we're going to be introducing vivid timelines. We're going to be talking a lot about the word tense. So the simple idea is we can use visual timelines, simple little drawings that show the sequence of events, to represent or replace or complement tense. I hope that you're not feeling tense, because that's not at all the kind of tense that I mean. What I mean is the wonder of time. And why do I think that time is such a wonderful thing? Well, let's look at this for a moment. Imagine that I'm looking at this glass and it contains this liquid. And then I keep looking at the glass and all of a sudden it contains this amount of liquid. And I keep looking at the glass and now it contains this amount of liquid. Are these three different glasses? This could be the same glass, and all I'm witnessing is the passage of time. Isn't that interesting? Here's another one. Let's say I start with a little tiny seed and I put it under the ground and I add water to it. And then later on, what happens is it sprouts leaves. And then it gets a stem. And then maybe I get a whole flower off of that. And isn't that something? What's past is time. And let's try one more of these. Let's say that I'm looking at this little scene. Here's a block sitting out in the middle of a desert. And there's the sun and there's the shadow. And what would happen if I looked again and now it looked like this? Time had passed. This is what I mean by the wonder of time, how we see the world shift in front of us. Now, we know that being able to place things in time is absolutely critical to our being able to understand stories, which is why almost every story begins with the statement, "Once upon a time," and that story might be the story of Little Red Riding Hood, where we've got some characters. We've got Little Red Riding Hood, and we've got the wolf, and we've got Grandma. Here's old Grandma. And we know that at some point, let's draw a little map. Let's say here's the forest. And here's Grandmother's house over here. Little Red Riding Hood starts over here. And the wolf starts deep in this forest. And Grandmother starts at home. So this is where we are at time 1. Once upon a time. But now, at time 2, Little Red Riding Hood is over here in the house. And my goodness, so is the wolf, but not Grandmother anymore. Grandma's gone, thanks to the wolf. This was time 2. We can tell a story by simply taking our characters, placing them in a location, and then moving time along, watching as they change their location. And this is exactly what we mean by storytelling. And storytelling, because we're serious business people, of course, we're not interested in talking about stories like Little Red Riding Hood, is we want to talk about stories about technology changes or financial changes, political changes. What we're going to do is we're still going to tell stories, and we're going to tell them in the same way. How powerful is this idea of once upon a time? Well, let's look at some more examples. Once upon a time, we didn't know how to fly. And then in the year, when? Well, 1903. 2 brothers figured out how to make an airplane fly. Once upon a time. There was a very clever man who figured out how to be able to use technology to do really incredible and amazing things. And that wasn't all that long period of time ago. And yet that has changed our perception of how small the world is and how fast things go. And once upon a time, back in the year of 1621, in fact, there was a big dinner that took place in what is now the United States, and I doubt if that dinner looked anything like this picture. You'll see here that there are some very happy pilgrims and there are some very happy Native Americans. And of course, what they were doing way back in 1621, once upon a time, is they were celebrating Thanksgiving, which is the holiday that's coming up next week for those of us in the United States, which is when we give thanks for this very first meal that I doubt was anywhere near as lovely as it looks in this picture. Now, why do I want to tell you a little bit about Thanksgiving? Well, because I want to give us a really good, solid example of how we can use timelines to make our ideas come literally visual. So one of my daughters is a little girl, and in school they're studying Thanksgiving. And so my daughter had to make up a story that talked about Ted the turkey. The big meal at Thanksgiving is everybody eats a turkey. So in the case of my daughter, she had to write a story that talked about Ted the turkey and what kind of disguise was Ted the turkey going to wear to make sure that he didn't get caught and eaten. So my daughter was questioning, saying, well, how do I go about writing this story? And I said, well, I have an idea. There's something I do with lots of business people. The first thing we drew is we draw a series of portraits to represent the characters in our story. And so my daughter did that, and she drew her character. Here's Ted the turkey, and here's Ted's cousin named Mustachio, and here's the hunter, and here's a DJ. Now, why did she come up with the DJ? I wasn't sure, but let me tell you a little bit about what happens next and why we introduce a timeline. Because here, folks, is the perfect way to tell any story in our own mind. First, we identify the characters, and then second, we create a timeline that says, okay, what did they do when? And so the timeline that my daughter created was a week. And let's say it starts on Tuesday, and it goes through Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and it goes all the way to the next Monday. And then what she was able to do is say, well, if this is Tuesday, what did my characters do on Tuesday? And then she could write a little short note about that. And what did they do on Wednesday? And what did they do at the end of the story? And what did they do along the way? And all of a sudden, we have this incredibly simple, powerful way to be able to hash together a nice story. The wonder of time. So we know, we serious folks, that what we're actually talking about is, as we move into vivid grammar, the idea of being able to make visual versions of things that we talk about and write about, is, we've already talked about the fact that we had a subject. That was our portraits, our simple little pictures. Then we had our verbs. We'll be getting to that in a later session. And then we talked last time about using our visual prepositions, otherwise known as maps, to be able to locate our characters in space. And this time, we're going to talk about the next piece, which is how to locate our characters and the events that they do in time. Now, why do we want to know how to draw timelines? Because we want to move into vivid thinking, visual, and plus verbal thinking. So instead of just telling someone a story, we can draw out the story as well. We can go from a lot of words that often are difficult to follow to a simple picture, which makes it much more clear. We've moved through our vivid grammar graph. We drew our portraits, we drew our charts, we drew our maps, and now we're focused on the next step, our timelines, which pull in our portraits again and show when do they interact. This is important in any language because it turns out that all of us have very parallel understandings of the passage of time. We are in the present. That's where we are right now. This is the place where we live. But something happened that was in the past, and something is going to happen that's going to put us in the future. This is now. Something happened yesterday, and something else is going to happen tomorrow. This structure that we put together of the passage of time is what gives us sense, this notion of cycles continuing around and around and being able to spread them out and say, I can see where we've been and I can see where we're going. Where our little fox, our verbal guy, will talk about yesterday, tomorrow, I will, I was, I am, I shall, last year, next year. All these words we give to define tense, all our visual hummingbird has to do is draw a little timeline. And that's where the visual among us are really going to have a great time. Lots of different kinds of timelines. Timelines can be very straightforward, the kind of thing we learned in school. Here are years going past, and here is when events took place. Timelines are useful when we want to represent the sequence of items. A happened, 1 happened, 2, 3, 4. If we want to, we can curl that timeline around in a circle to show that something is actually happening in a cycle, which is interesting if we think about a sort of a timeline of a life cycle. Which came first, the turkey or the egg? Well, there's an interesting one to sort of think about for a while. Since one begets the other, we have something that we call swim lanes, which is a fancy term for mapping out several parallel timelines. So we can begin to see the interaction across different groups of when they need to do things. We can have a straightforward linear progression of time moving in one direction or another, or we can start to combine many of these and get the infamous Gantt chart, which allows us to show the temporal interaction of a whole bunch of different characters. How do we draw a timeline? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to identify some milestones. So when I talk about milestones, they're simply things that happened. This is what happened, or 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 maybe this is what happened. All we have to do are identify some milestones. Then we need to create a very simple coordinate system. Timelines have the simplest of all. As we've talked about, we simply move from now to the future. We plot our milestones in, and then we look and see if the sequence we've mapped out actually holds. Is that realistic? Is that a reasonable representation of what happened or what we expect to happen? So that's how we draw a timeline. And now I'd like all of you to pull out your sheet of paper and pen. I want us to do our quick little 1-minute timeline drawing exercise now. I'd like you to pick one of these 3 subjects, and we're going to draw kind of a 1-minute timeline of it. You could choose your morning routine. What kind of timeline would you draw to show how your morning works out? If you work for another company, maybe if you work for yourself, what's the process you go through to try to get more money? Or maybe draw a timeline mapping out when you think things are going to happen in your next project. So I'd like each of you to work on that on your own for a moment, and I'm going to go ahead and work on mine. And let's draw silently for a minute or so. Okay, well, about a minute's passed. I would love to see that some of the timelines that you've drawn. Tell you what, for some of you, if you want to take a picture with your phone or scan in the 1-minute timelines you've just drawn, send them through to me, and we'll review some of those at our next session in 2 weeks when we review homework. So let's quickly look at the timeline that I drew. Just very, very quick, and I made this up on the spot. I hadn't thought about which one I was going to draw, so I decided to do my next project, which I'm working on a new book. And I first identified, as far as I can remember from having written books in the past, what were some of the things that I know happen? Well, I need to write a proposal, then a contract. I have to write a draft. There's an acceptance. There's a couple of reviews, and then it goes into publication. So I thought, well, let's go ahead and say that today is here. I'm very close to having the proposal done. So there's my proposal stage. I'll submit that to my agent, who will review it for me, and then we'll submit it to the publisher, and if they like it, then we'll get a contract. And then comes the real work, which is I need to then create the draft of the book. I actually need to write the whole thing, all of the pages and all of the pictures and all of the words. And for me, that typically takes about 9 months to do. And so if I map this out properly, from the time it takes to get the draft done through editorial review, should put me into late 2013. And if all goes according to plan and the book is accepted, then we should have a publication date right around late 2013. So right around a year from now, perhaps maybe very early 2014. And so, of course, the beauty of putting together a timeline is I can take all of these sort of random steps and put them into what appears to be a logical order. That's one of the good things about a timeline. Even more importantly, though, is I can see exactly what it is that I need to do in order to get this book to happen. I can say, aha, because I can see it mapped out in this timeline, I can get a sense of where do I need to allocate my time, where are my critical milestones that I need to make sure of, and where do we end up in time when it's all over. And I thought the way to close out our discussion on timelines is just to get inspired. I think that a good way to start would just be to say, let's go ahead and make this kind of timeline of timelines. So if way back in the past, I don't know when, but let's just say a long time ago, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, I have a suspicion that most people might have looked at time as something that was kind of cyclical. You know, the sun went up, the sun went down, the moon came out, and I looked at life as basically just a series of cycles. Things went around and around and around. So if I wanted to make a timeline, it might have looked kind of like a cycle. And then at some point, who knows when, maybe people's minds shifted and said, well, if I uncurl that timeline, that cycle out, and I lay it out in a kind of a linear fashion, maybe that gives me the ability to look at each step a little bit more in detail. Perhaps. This seems to be the way that historically we've gone as we represent time. And then someone along the way said, well, isn't it interesting? If I can map something out in time, well, perhaps I can map out many things in time that are happening in parallel. And then we started to get really complicated and really sophisticated about this, where we end up today, where we have not only the ability to map out many things in parallel, but we now have the ability to show what is the influence of one upon the other. And as we've moved through this, so this is kind of now, and I think as we've moved through this series of increasingly linear ways of looking at time, for right or for wrong, it gives us a sense of being more in control of time, which is a total fallacy, but it does give us a sense of being in control. So what I thought we might do is look through just a series of timelines and see if we can find examples of each one of these kinds and see what they show us. So let's go ahead and look at something like phases of the moon. You know, the moon goes around, phases of the moon. What might be an example of a linear timeline? What might be something where it goes in parallel, and where might we have something that looks like a real full-on Gantt chart? So let's take a quick look. I was looking for cyclical timelines, and I came across something pretty interesting. This is a timeline that is the history of the Earth. And for whatever reason, this person decided to draw the history of the Earth in cyclical form, basing it on a 24-hour clock. So there's a nice metaphor. Let's start out with a clock. Everybody knows how to read time. And let's say the time starts at midnight and we work our way around. So here's the formation of the Earth. And, you know, from midnight until 3 a.m., there were lots of meteorites bombarding the Earth. And then perhaps the origin of life, right around 4 a.m. The oldest fossils, right around 5:30. And then we go all the way from 6 a.m. all the way past noon up to about 2 p.m. and we see abundant banded iron formation, so lots of sediments being laid. Oh, and look at this, all of a sudden single-celled algae begins to appear at 2 p.m. Interesting. Sexual reproduction starts at about 6 in the evening. And here we have seaweed starting to appear at 8 p.m., the very first little trilobites there. Oh, where are our dinosaurs? Well, our dinosaurs come out here right getting close to about 11 p.m., almost midnight. Mammals come out at 11:39, and humans appear just about, 17 seconds before midnight. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting way to show it, but it's difficult to read a circular timeline. So I thought, what would happen if we just unfurled it and said, and let's map things out. So if here's the beginning, here's the formation of the Earth, and we go through all of our various steps, and here we are at midnight again at the end, we humans are appearing right about here. I thought, wow, now that timeline begins to make a little bit more sense. So then I thought, okay, well, that's a good example of one that's in a cycle. Well, let's look at one that's linear. And I thought, well, you know, something that's fun. Why not? The history of video games. I don't know how many people on this, raise your hand if you have ever played a video game or if you find video games interesting to play. Look at that. Every single hand is going up. For whatever reason, we love to play video games. So let's go ahead and look at a linear timeline now, where we can begin to map things out. So if we go back to first generation timelines, 1967, some of the first ones appear. Some of the very first Pong-like games come out in 1972, all called first generation games. Second generation games start to come out in 1977 with Nintendo. Isn't that something? And then we have Q*bert coming out in 1982, continuing through third generation games starting in 1983. And here's Mario for the first time appearing, and things start to get a little bit more sophisticated. Zelda appears in 1986. We now move into the fourth generation games around 1988. Let's go ahead and continue scrolling along. All I've done is just scroll sideways now. Fourth generation games, we get Sonic in there. Fifth generation games starting in 1993. Now we start to get the PlayStation appearing. We start to get N64, the Nintendo comes out, start to get more sophisticated tools. Sixth generation appears about the year 1999, 2000, and then we come up to today where we're in the seventh generation in 2005. We had the Xbox 360 appearing, and 2006 we had Sony PlayStation 3 and the Wii, Nintendo Wii. And now we're ready for the eighth generation to appear. And what is it going to be? Well, we'll have to ask ourselves as the year rolls out, because eighth generation games are starting to come out. So there's an example of a timeline. And I'll tell you, that makes looking at the history of video games a whole lot more exciting than if you were to go to Wikipedia and read the history of video games, which goes on at great length. Blah, 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 blah. I'll tell you, it's a lot more interesting just to look at the timeline and get a sense of how it comes together. And then I went a little bit further and said, can we start to find an example of timelines that map out multiple parallel paths in time? And I really encourage you, this is magnificent. For anybody who's ever seen the Star Wars movies or read The Lord of the Rings or seen Jurassic Park, I strongly encourage you to go take a look at this crazy cartoon website, wonderful work, xkcd.com. And one of the things that you can find is the complete hand-drawn timeline of the Lord of the Rings series by J.R.R. Tolkien. And just to give you a little zoom in on what are we looking at here. So if we zoom in on one part, here are all the characters. We've got the hobbits of Merry and Pippin and Sam and Frodo and Bilbo, and here's Gandalf the Wizard. And here's where they all start, and here's what's going on. And as they move through time, here they're moving to places. Here's the council. Here's the fellowship gets broken. And it's magnificent because you can actually go through, and what we normally see as a single linear progression across multiple characters, you can actually begin to see how they all interact. And of course, he did the same thing for Star Wars and others, and it's absolutely magnificent. It's a really, really wonderful way to replay in your mind a story that you may or may not know and be able to see when does everything happen. Which brings us to my last drawing that I wanted to share with you, our last timeline, because for those of us who use timelines a lot, we tend to use Microsoft Project, where it will help us build our Gantt charts, which allow us to say, I've identified all of these different tasks, and I've identified all of these different time periods, and here's where they all map out in sequence next to each other. And this gives me the wonderful sense of being in control of the situation when, in fact, those gremlins of time are laughing at me saying, oh, he doesn't really have any control over it all, because time does just keep going around and around and around and around and around. And I think that's where I want to end it for you with just a couple of last thoughts about the beauty of our timelines. Thought number one, if we have a story we want to tell, and that could be a entertaining story, or that could be a business story, and let's go ahead and say that from now on we want to make our business stories entertaining. So let's go ahead and put those in the same bubble. Instead of listing out go ahead and create a timeline that says I started here, I made a little change, I made a big change, and we end up with something completely different. That's the beauty of a timeline. Thought number two. It allows us, number one, to get our thoughts in some kind of order, which is very helpful for us to be able to say, I do have control over what's going on. I'm not going to let time run me. I'm going to take charge, and here's the timeline I'm going to use to do it. So I'd like to encourage you to think about timelines. Draw them as often as you can. One of the fundamental tools for making sure that people understand our ideas. And now, of course, it's going to be your turn. So as usual, here's the way we're going to handle this. I'm going to give you your homework assignment, your timeline homework assignment, and then I'm going to turn it over to one of our associates who did a beautiful job on last week's assignment and let him take us through it. So first off, here is your homework 4 timelines. Number 1, I would like you to draw one basic timeline from this list. I'd like you to draw a timeline of your ideal day. Or draw a timeline of your family history. Or, if you want to get really big on us, go ahead and draw a timeline of the 5 most important events in history. That one sounds kind of intriguing to do. That's our warm-up, and then what I'd like you to do is draw a little timeline, be inspired by what we saw at XKCD perhaps. Draw a timeline of your favorite movie. Identify the characters, and then see if you can't map out when they're interacting with each other. And after we've practiced with the movie, now comes the serious one. I'd like you to draw a timeline of your favorite project or a project you're working on now. What is it and when is it that you need to get everything done in order to have great success with that project? So that's your homework. At this point, let's review some student work. And Colin, I'm going to turn you on now. Colin, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly, Colin. So Colin, I believe that you are down in South Africa, is that right?
Yeah, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Down in Johannesburg. Well, Colin, I'm going to show your maps, and this again was the homework of maps. So I'd ask people to map out a bit of their own career, and Colin, I'm going to turn it over to you to just walk us through what your drawings show, okay?
Yeah, fine, thank you. I'm not sure whether this was last week's assignment, but this was my interpretation of a Venn diagram. I belong to an international networking organization called Business Networking International. And on the left circle, I tried to map the business model, which consists of weekly meetings, attendance registers, etc., etc. And then I drew 2 other circles. The top right-hand one is a business-to-consumer model in South Africa, and the bottom one is a business-to-business model in South Africa. And I tried to see how the overall B&I model fits, and I saw some serious discrepancies. But it gave me focus on, I'm mainly a business-to-business model in South Africa. So
okay.
It gave me tremendous focus.
Very good. So drawing out the Venn diagram actually helped you to see where some things might be missing.
And where I should be adapting the other models. I mean, ideally all 3 circles should coincide, but so yeah, it gave me great perspective on how I'm adapting the overall business model to my business in South Africa.
Wonderful. Shall I go ahead to the next picture then, the next map?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so this was where we were mapping out our career, I believe.
Yeah, this was very challenging. It took me nearly 2 weeks to produce this. But I worked on your slide where I used a build. So I mapped my career in terms of the major sort of functions and tried to draw little pictures of them.
So go ahead and walk us through. So obviously you started as a student.
I started as a student. I then graduated as an engineer. I practiced my engineering and I became a manager in a corporate organization, and I eventually became a director of a company. I then started to branch out, and I started to teach people what I'd learned through my career and facilitate business processes. And then I made the big plunge and became an entrepreneur and tried to use all of this experience to run my own business.
Fantastic. Well, let's push ahead then. So I see you've now mapped it out on a timeline. Excellent.
So then I said, I've got to create a timeline for this. So I fitted roughly those job titles to, and you can see I precede your video games.
Video games began right about here, didn't they?
So long career. So roughly those fitted the sort of the timeline I wanted to create on the x-axis.
Excellent. And I'm going to go ahead because I know you've got something else to share. So
And then it was, you said, well, now fit it to a location. Now I was playing with this for some days, but basically I've lived through this long life in two places, in the UK and England, and then I emigrated to South Africa. So I tried to sort of see how that timeline fitted to those locations.
Fantastic. So student in engineering back in Liverpool, and then manager and working with the technology, with the corporate environment, and up through entrepreneur in Johannesburg. Yes? Very good. Okay. And now I know we've got another one here because I think you mapped something else in.
Well, then you said to me, or you said, show your income. Now, I could have done the income on the vertical axis, but you said just show it in rough terms. So at that point, the sort of light came on, and I said, I've earned various levels of income, but it's very different to the level of job satisfaction I've achieved. So I decided to just show the income as rough sort of stacks of coins.
No, it's very good. So it went up as you became director. Obviously, probably not surprising, it went down a bit as you became a teacher.
Yeah, when I then decided that that sort of career path was not for me, I had to absorb a drop of income, and I think you see it in the final one, because the level of satisfaction, in fact, went up, not in direct relation to the income.
And now that you're an entrepreneur on your own, I think we have, yes, here we go. Okay.
So this one sort of says it, that I'm currently achieving the highest level of satisfaction in my whole career. And if you look at the sort of, when I was a company director in a corporate environment, I probably had well, it's all relative to time, but the highest level of income, but probably the lowest level of satisfaction.
So it's kind of like you went right off a cliff here, isn't it, to become director? Well, there's probably a lesson for many people who follow the same path.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Colin. So the good news is, as an entrepreneur, you're doing well, you're making money, and you have high satisfaction. So that's pretty hard to beat.
Satisfaction, yeah, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you. Thank you, Colin.
This was extremely challenging, but it's so rewarding.
Well, fantastic. Well, and on that note, I want to thank you all again. I'm going to wrap this up now. I've got to go catch my flight over to Amsterdam. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. Hey, thank you all for another great lesson. This is Dan signing off from the Napkin Academy, but don't go away. Now on our new platform, you can still submit your homework. Debbie, our community manager, is going to join you right now to show you exactly how to do that, and I really encourage you, do your homework. Okay, take it away, Debbie. See you soon.
We hope you enjoyed this Napkin Academy classic video. We've made it easier than ever to share your homework. After you've completed your homework and have a JPEG or PNG file saved on your computer, come back to this course. Once you're back here, scroll to the bottom of the screen, and in the comments box, you can add a comment. I'm just going to call this one My Homework. You can also add images by clicking on the Insert Edit Image button here. In the source box, click on the file. In the Images window, click on Upload, and then click on Add Files. This is going to take you to your computer where you can search for your images. I'm just going to search for mine in Pictures, and I'm going to choose this image here. You can also add multiple images here. Click Upload. After the upload is complete, click Close. Then scroll down, and you'll see that the last image is here, and it's checked. This is the one we just uploaded. Click Insert. I suggest in the Dimensions box you change the maximum to 1200 pixels and leave the Constrained Proportions box checked. You can also add an image description here if you'd like. Click OK. You'll see that your image has been added to your comment. And now the last step, The most important one, make sure that you click the green comment button here to upload your homework to the Napkin Academy. We hope to see your homework soon.